Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. The Battle of Nygard. In year 41 of the Common Reckoning, a force of dwarves led by Ardban the Mine Lord marched south into the lands of Haldan, the king of the dwarves of the Dark Hills. Ardban's objective was to put an end to the depredations of Haldan in the lands between Southvale and the Silver Stream. Ardban marched with 300 armoured dwarves, with shields and spears. Approximately 100 of these were dwarves of his own retinue, while the remainder were mercenaries, paid for by the Council of Guildsmen. Supporting the spear dwarves were approximately 350 unarmoured dwarves, bearing crossbows. The majority of these had also been hired by the Council of Guildsmen, but some 120 of them were dwarves from the lands between Southvale and the Silver Stream, whose farms had been burned by, and who had been waging guerrilla warfare against, Haldan's soldiers. Their leader was Norby. They were not fighting for pay, but for hatred and revenge. Haldan's stronghold was the Hillhold, under the shadow of the Dark Hills, and around the Hillhold were the farms of Haldan's people. As Ardban marched south, the first such farm he reached was Nygard, and it was here that Haldan had determined to meet him. Haldan had mustered all of the troops available to him. He had around 350 spear dwarves, grim dwarves in mail, bearing shields and spears. These were supported by approximately 250 dwarves wearing coats of gambeson and carrying crossbows. Haldan arrayed his spear dwarves in ranks, with the buildings and fields of Nygard on their left and a small hill on their right. Behind that hill he placed half his crossbow dwarves, with the remainder in advance of the spear dwarves and to their left. Ardban's forces emerged from the fringes of the forest. On his far right he stationed Norby and his crossbow dwarves. To their left was a group of about 120 of Ardban's spear dwarves, advancing through the last scattered patches of trees, behind a screen of more crossbow dwarves. On the far left of Ardban's line, beyond a clump of trees, were his remaining spear dwarves, again advancing behind a screen of crossbow dwarves. Haldan ordered the crossbow dwarves on his right forward, up onto the hill, ready to shoot at Ardban's dwarves as they came within range. The centre of Ardban's army pushed forward, the spear dwarves advancing cautiously behind their screen of crossbow dwarves. Again Haldan ordered his crossbow dwarves forward, on both flanks now, seeking an opportunity to loose bolts at the approaching foes. Intervening clumps of trees obscured Ardban's view of these movements, but messengers from his formations were now reporting to him that he faced a large enemy force. He ordered the crossbow dwarves on his left flank to move up to the patch of woodland in front of them, seeking a position of cover to engage their opponents. Having covered his flanks, Haldan ordered the front rank of his spear dwarves to advance, seeking to close with Ardban's dwarves as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, Ardban's crossbow dwarves had taken up their positions in the trees and commenced a ferocious exchange of crossbow bolts with Haldan's dwarves on the hill. Despite being in the cover of the trees, Ardban's dwarves had by far the worse of this exchange. Encouraged by this, Haldan pushed the crossbow dwarves on his left flank further forward, seeking to engage with Norby and his dwarves, even as the front rank of his spear dwarves continued their advance. But they were advancing into the teeth of the crossbow dwarves in Ardban's centre. Even as the last survivors of Ardban's left group of crossbow dwarves were being pierced with crossbow bolts, their fellows in the centre group were causing the first casualties among Haldan's spear dwarves. And as more and more of the advance group of Haldan's spear dwarves fell, Ardban brought up the spear dwarves on his left flank. On Ardburn's right flank, Norby observed the crossbow dwarves advancing towards him, and ordered his dwarves to take cover behind the wooded area on their left. They then crept stealthily through the trees and started loosing crossbow bolts at their adversaries, who responded in kind. But Norby's dwarves had much experience of hiding behind trees and picking off targets, and they had the better of this fight. Ardburn's spear dwarves in the centre continued to move forward, right up to the crossbow dwarves in front of them, who continued loosing bolts at Haldan's spear dwarves, and their shooting was effective. Haldan's spear dwarves, who had advanced so confidently, now fell back towards their fellows in the second rank. And now Ardburn's crossbow dwarves advanced to keep Haldan's retreating spear dwarves within range, but this brought them in turn within the range of Haldan's crossbow dwarves on the hill. As the two groups of crossbow dwarves exchanged shots, all of Haldan's remaining spear dwarves formed up in a single block and started to advance, and they did so confidently as the crossbow dwarves on the hill dealt with Ardburn's centre crossbow dwarves in identical fashion to those on his left, and wiped them out. Ardburn ordered both groups of his spear dwarves forward and combined them into a single body, which advanced through a storm of crossbow bolts towards Haldan's spear dwarves. Norby and his dwarves had finished off the crossbow dwarves on Haldan's left. He now ordered his surviving dwarves forward with the intention of getting onto the flank of Haldan's spear dwarves. But Haldan was not going to hang around and be shot at. He ordered his spear dwarves forward, and the front rank charged into their foes. Haldan watched with satisfaction the sprawling melee that ensued, until he was distracted by crossbow bolts whistling past his ears. Norby's dwarves had got round behind him and were making their presence known. Haldan again decided not to hang around and be shot at. Even as his crossbow dwarves started to loose bolts back at the interlopers, he detached a small group of spear dwarves to drive them off, while he charged into the fray, which was now breaking up into confusion. And it was somewhere in that confusion, as his dwarves were driven back, that Ardban met his end. A small group of his personal retinue stood over his body and grimly defended it. The remainder of Ardburn's dwarves fled. But Norby lived, and Norby ran after the fleeing dwarves, blowing his horn, calling them to remember their dignity, and they rallied to him. It was too late to save the day. Even at that moment the last surviving dwarves defending Ardburn's corpse were cut down, although Haldan paid a high price for their lives. But Norby was able to lead Ardburn's surviving dwarves from the field in good enough order that Haldan did not immediately attempt to pursue them. Thus ended the Battle of Nygard.